It didn't smell like war, it smelled like furniture. In a dimly lit hangar just outside Hamburg, German engineers huddled around the wreckage, their white coats already streaked with graphite and oil. Beneath harsh floodlights lay a Mosquito bomber, captured almost intact after a forced landing in a farmer's field. Its pale wooden panels seemed almost laughably domestic, as if stolen from a workshop rather than torn from the sky. They had been warned. This was Britain's fastest bomber, a machine said to outrun even Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs at full throttle. And yet, the claim appeared absurd. To these Luftwaffe engineers, wood was a relic, something suited for biplanes and museum exhibits, not the era of jets and high-octane fuel. Dear friends, if this video has reached you, it's not by chance. Right now, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. Write a number from 1 to 5 in the comments. I will personally respond to the first 50 comments, and make sure to watch the video until the end. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, senior materials analyst from the Luftfahrtministerium, adjusted his spectacles and tapped a panel with his knuckle. The sound wasn't metallic, it was dull, resonant, like knocking on a coffin. "Plywood," he murmured, disbelief creeping into his voice. Around him, the technicians chuckled quietly. "A wooden bomber?" one whispered. The English must have run out of aluminum. They expected splinters and sawdust, not a plane that has humiliated our air defenses for nearly 2 years. Outside, rain hissed against the hangar roof. Inside, the sharp, sweet chemical tang of phenolic resin clung to their clothes and throats, somewhere between varnish and scorched sugar. They worked like surgeons, cataloging every component with precision. No rivets, no welds. Each panel was bonded, not bolted. The seams were so flawless they reflected light like polished marble. When Henkel tried to pry 2 layers apart with a chisel, the blade snapped. He frowned. "This is no carpenter's glue," he said. His assistant speculated, "Maybe a kind of resin? Bakelite?" Henkel shook his head. "Bakelite is brittle. This is elastic, heat-resistant, almost alive." Peering through a magnifying lens, he saw fibers fused together, grain flowing like living tissue. And then came the artistry, the craftsmanship. Every curve of the fuselage molded with sculptor-like precision. The British had built a plane the way one builds a violin, layer by layer, tone by tone. Each contour served a purpose, reducing drag, channeling air, hiding immense strength beneath elegance. As they measured, photographed, and recorded, the laughter faded. The more they touched the Mosquito, the less they mocked it. It was as if the minds that had built it had anticipated their disbelief. By midnight, the floor was strewn with sawdust, sketches, and coffee cups. Henkel sat back, rubbing his temples, surrounded by fragments that defied logic. His clipboard didn't lie. This toy plane had outpaced every metal bomber they possessed. Somehow, wood had defeated steel. He stared at the pale curve of a wing root and whispered, "How?" The irony gnawed at him. Germany, the land of precision engineering, was being outpaced by a bomber glued together in furniture factories. Outside, the distant hum of night bombers echoed over the city, the sound of an empire slowly eroding. Inside that hangar, amidst glue and wet wood, a question emerged. Not whether the Mosquito worked, but why, and what secret lay hidden in that resin that made it unstoppable. Rewind to 1938. While Europe braced for another mechanized war of steel and fire, one man approached the British Air Ministry with a plan that seemed almost absurd. Geoffrey de Havilland Tall composed, quietly stubborn unfolded blueprints of a bomber that defied every modern aviation doctrine. It had no defensive guns, no armor plating, and most audaciously of all, It was to be made almost entirely of wood. The officials listened politely, anticipating a joke. When none came, they rejected it outright. Metal was the future, they insisted. Wood belonged to the past. But de Havilland didn't flinch. He understood something that spreadsheets and bureaucrats could not. Speed was armor, and simplicity was survival. At the time, Britain was already stretched thin. Aluminum. The lifeblood of aircraft production was consumed faster than it could be refined. Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lancasters, they all devoured every sheet the nation could muster. But de Havilland saw opportunity in scarcity. His company had years of experience with wooden construction for light aircraft and racing planes. Britain's countryside brimmed with skilled hands, furniture makers, piano builders, cabinet craftsmen, all capable of shaping wood, but locked out of the metal war. What if, he wondered, their expertise could build something faster, lighter, and quieter than anything else in the world? He envisioned a bomber without turrets, a two-man cockpit streamlined like a bullet, layers of birch plywood bonded to cores of Ecuadorian balsa materials, chosen not for glamour, but for geometry. Birch for strength, balsa for lightness, joined by a glue stronger than any mechanical fastener. Laminated monocoque construction, long used in furniture, became his equation of survival. Every ounce saved on armor was invested in speed. If it could outrun enemy fighters, it needn't fight at all. When war erupted in 1939, the idea seemed to vanish under reality's weight. The Air Ministry demanded bombers bristling with guns, turrets, and armor metal flying fortresses designed to trade blows. Yet war humbles certainty. By 1940, after France's fall and the desperate Blitz, shortages forced reconsideration. De Havilland returned, insisting his wooden bomber could be built in furniture factories without stealing a single sheet of aluminum from Spitfire production. Reluctantly, the Air Ministry approved one prototype. Autumn 1940, under gray Hertfordshire skies, the first Mosquito took shape. Piano builders sanded its wings. Violin makers carved its curved nose. Every seam was bonded with phenol formaldehyde resin from furniture laboratories, a synthetic glue that hardened into something close to amber. Imagine a material born at the intersection of craft and chemistry. Thin layers of wood pressed together under heat until they fused into something neither wood nor plastic, yet stronger, lighter, and more resilient than either. It was a creation that defied expectation, a triumph of ingenuity that would soon change the skies forever. On November 25, 1940, the prototype, painted a striking training yellow, rolled onto the runway at Hatfield. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the son of its designer, climbed into the cockpit. The engine's twin Merlin Spizes roared with the pent-up energy of restrained beasts. The crowd braced for struggle. Surely, they thought, such a fragile-looking aircraft could not rise unscathed. But instead of faltering, it leapt forward, as if gravity itself had been deceived. In moments, it climbed faster than any bomber the observers had ever seen. At altitude, its speed surpassed 390 miles per hour, faster than the Spitfire Mk1, faster than any fighter in service. The Air Ministry observer, who had moments before been silently skeptical, now whispered in disbelief. A wooden plane had outflown the finest machines of steel and legend. That night, de Havilland walked alone through his workshop. Half-finished frames glowed under the lamplight. He pressed his hand to one of the laminated panels and felt the warmth of the curing glue. Smooth, alive, brimming with promise. The world would never see war the same way again. A bomber built from furniture wood had just proven that imagination could outpace fear. When the Mosquito entered combat, it carried no guns, no gunners, and no illusions. Its survival relied entirely on mathematics, on precision, and speed. The first operational squadrons to receive the aircraft in 1941 stared in quiet disbelief. Pilots accustomed to lumbering Blenheims and Wellingtons were now asked to fly a bomber that looked more like a racing plane, slim, graceful, and unprotected. Its crew consisted of just 2 men, a pilot and a navigator, shoulder to shoulder, in a cockpit barely large enough for both. There was no rear gunner, no armor between them, and flak bursts waited patiently above the clouds. The flight manual left no room for hope. If intercepted, do not fight run, keep the throttle wide open, and trust the Merlin engines. Even the once skeptical Air Ministry became obsessed with the Mosquito's speed. Official trials at Boscombe Down clocked it at nearly 400 miles per hour, faster than any operational Luftwaffe fighter. But speed on paper and survival over enemy territory were not the same. The Mosquito would need to prove that agility alone could replace armor. Its baptism came on September 20th, 1941, when Mosquitoes from No. 15 Squadron took off from Swanton Morley for their first daylight bombing raid over Oslo. The objective was surgical: strike the Gestapo headquarters and escape before the enemy could react. Flying just 50 feet above the sea, the wooden wings sliced through mist and spray. Radar stations detected them too late. By the time Luftwaffe command sounded the alarm, the Mosquitoes were already returning. Fighters scrambled from Stavanger, but the gap could not be closed. Observers on the ground reported a ghostly roar, then silence, as if the aircraft had vanished into thin air. Every plane returned unscathed. Next came an even bolder test. In January 1943, a Mosquito reconnaissance flight penetrated deep into Berlin's airspace in broad daylight. City sirens wailed, not for a massive raid, but for 2 unarmed bombers moving faster than any pursuer. Luftwaffe radar operators watched helplessly as the blips accelerated beyond pursuit. When the Mosquitoes dropped their 500-pound bombs, Hermann Göring himself was in conference. Furious, he erupted, calling it a personal insult and ordering every interceptor to engage. None succeeded. By early 1943, Mosquito crews had begun to understand the machine's rhythm. At 25,000 feet, it danced above flak bursts like a leaf in a storm. Laminated wood absorbed vibrations that would have shattered metal skins. Even direct hits often failed to ignite fires. The absence of aluminum meant fewer sparks, less fuel vapor ignition. Pilots described it as flying a living creature. Flexible, forgiving, responsive. One crew, returning from a low-level raid over Cologne, recounted tracer fire chasing them through the Rhine Valley. The shells seemed to float beside them, then fall away. It was as if the air itself protected us, they said. The Mosquito's legend spread rapidly. British newspapers dubbed it the Wooden Wonder. German pilots whispered, Der Teufel aus Holz, the devil of wood. Its effect on morale was immediate. Luftwaffe squadrons in occupied Europe received new orders. If a Mosquito is sighted, do not pursue unless conditions are perfect. It could not be caught in level flight, and in dives, it exceeded structural limits for German aircraft. Every mission added a new layer to its mythology. In February 1943, Mosquitoes from NOS 105 and 139 squadrons carried out a daylight raid on Berlin, timed to coincide with a speech by Göring. As his voice echoed through the Reichstag, windows rattled with explosions. The precision was so perfect that German propaganda censors could not mask the embarrassment. Wooden bombers had struck the heart of the Third Reich and returned. The success reshaped everything. The Royal Air Force redesigned operations around the Mosquito's unique blend of speed and stealth. It became the aircraft of choice for photo reconnaissance, pathfinding, and surgical bombing. Every sortie reinforced a simple truth: the less you carried, the faster you flew. The faster you flew, the longer you survived. Pilots began to believe in the legend. calling it the plane that forgot how to die. Across the channel, disbelief in German labs had turned into obsession. How could a plywood aircraft humiliate their finest machines? To the Luftwaffe High Command, it was no mere military failure. It was a scientific insult. Somewhere inside those deceptively smooth wooden panels lay a secret the Reich was desperate to uncover. In the spring of 1943, a British Mosquito on a reconnaissance mission over northern Germany was caught in a storm of flak. The pilot, against all odds, glided for miles before crash landing in a marsh near Hamburg. Miraculously, the aircraft did not ignite. When German troops arrived, they expected twisted metal, molten fragments, anything but what they found. Instead, there lay something that resembled a broken boat more than a bomber. Smooth wooden panels, light enough for a man to lift, still carrying the faint scent of resin and smoke. To the Luftwaffe's technical branch, this was a prize beyond imagination. Orders were immediate. Recover everything. Every fragment, no matter how small, was to be sent to a secret analysis hangar outside Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier testing ground. Under harsh floodlights, the Mosquito rested on wooden trestles like a patient on an operating table. Engineers circled it, clipboards in hand, breaths fogging in the cold. These men were accustomed to steel and rivets, welding torches and precision gauges, not sanding blocks, chisels, and glue. The first cuts were tentative, almost surgical. Each layer revealed deeper mysteries. The outer skin, a mere few millimeters of birch veneer, was astonishingly uniform. Beneath it, a honeycomb of balsa wood lighter than air, yet remarkably stiff. Another layer of birch followed, fused seamlessly, as if it had grown from a single tree. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, leading the investigation, stared at the flawless joints in stunned silence. A specialist in material fatigue, he had spent years studying the failures of metal airframes. Now, confronted with wood, he muttered, "They've turned carpentry into engineering." His team measured density, tensile strength, and shear resistance. Every result defied expectation. The laminated composite bore nearly twice the load of aluminum at half the weight. It resisted moisture, heat, and vibration. When a technician tried to separate two panels with a hydraulic press, the wood cracked, but the adhesive bond remained intact. The Germans had used casein glue in their own wooden trainers and gliders, cheap, easy to produce, but prone to degradation in humidity and heat. This British glue was different. It seemed impervious to everything. Henkel ordered a chemical analysis. The lab reported a compound unknown in German aviation, a synthetic resin based on phenol and formaldehyde, catalyzed under pressure. When heated, it didn't soften. It hardened further, forming a thermoset polymer that bound the wood fibers on a molecular level. In essence, it was synthetic armor hidden within wood. Frustration gnawed at Henkel. Germany's chemical industry, once the envy of the world, had produced synthetic fuel and rubber, yet it had never conceived this adhesive. The reason was painfully simple: resources. Phenolic resins required phenol and methanol from coal, tar both consumed by explosives production. Even if the Luftwaffe had known the formula, it couldn't have been produced in quantity. The discovery sparked a mixture of admiration and despair. The Mosquito was not only fast, it was ingenious. Every component reflected adaptation. The fuselage, molded in two mirror halves over concrete forms in furniture factories, formed an airtight shell without internal bracing. The result? Smoother, lighter, stronger than any riveted construction. One young engineer, Vogel, peered through a magnifying lens at a wing cross-section. "It looks alive," he whispered. The glue lines traced patterns like leaf veins. He was right. Under stress, the structure flexed instead of fracturing, absorbed shocks, dissipated energy, and returned to shape. In a world obsessed with rigidity, the Mosquito had been built to bend. When Henkel presented his findings to Luftwaffe Command, the room fell silent. On the table lay two samples, aluminum and laminated birch, bonded with British resin. He bent the wooden sample. It snapped back. The aluminum remained deformed. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have been building the wrong kind of strength." But pride dies hard. Some officers refused to believe that glue could win a war. Others demanded a German replica Muka, or not to prove the concept. Yet deep down, the engineers knew the truth. They could copy shape, dimensions, even engines, but not the soul of the Mosquito, the glue that transformed fragile wood into a weapon. As samples were packed for Berlin, the scent of British resin lingered, sweet, sharp, unyielding. Henkel ran a gloved hand over a splintered wing and whispered, "They built this in a furniture factory, and we, with all our steel, cannot catch it." The order came from above. If the British could construct a wooden bomber faster than any German fighter, Germany would build one faster, stronger, deadlier. The project was mockingly named Muka the Knot, a tiny insect meant to sting the British Mosquito. On paper, it was a statement of pride, a claim that German engineering could master anything Allied ingenuity produced. In practice, it became a slow-motion tragedy of overconfidence. The first prototypes were assembled at the Luftfahrtversuchsanstalt in Braunschweig, based on Mosquito blueprints and Henkel's meticulously catalogued fragments. From the start, the numbers betrayed them. Lightweight balsa imported from Ecuador was unavailable due to Allied blockades. German engineers substituted pine and beech harder, heavier, more abundant. A wing section that weighed 280 kilograms in the Mosquito ballooned to 410 kilograms in the Muka. The glue was another compromise. Without phenolic resin, they reverted to casein adhesive, mixed with formalin to slow degradation. It performed in dry weather, but heat and humidity caused it to soften, a flaw every engineer recognized, but none dared report. Still, propaganda demanded results. Henkel's warnings about adhesive instability were quietly rewritten. Production orders were issued to furniture factories in Dresden and Kassel, the very type of workshops the British had used successfully. German workers, however, faced raw material shortages, constant air raids, and a lack of trained labor. Creativity had birthed the Mosquito. Desperation birthed the Muka. By late 1943, the first prototype stood complete, a sleek, pale imitation of the British aircraft. Under floodlights, it looked convincing, a smooth fuselage, identical dimensions. But the illusion ended at liftoff. During its maiden flight, Hauptmann Ernst Kessler noted sluggish controls and unexpected vibration at high speed. At 350 miles per hour, the wings began to resonate. The laminated layers groaned audibly. Within minutes, thin cracks appeared along the leading edges. He throttled back and landed hard, the undercarriage collapsing under the strain. When engineers finally examined the wreckage, the culprit revealed itself quietly, almost innocuously. Moisture. It had seeped into the glue lines, softening the adhesive just enough to compromise the joints. The glue hadn't failed completely, yet even this subtle weakness distorted the aerodynamic shape. In aviation, just enough can be fatal. The second prototype fared no better. Built with reinforced adhesives and extra bracing, it flew heavier, slower, and with less grace. On paper, it could reach 360 miles per hour, faster than a Heinkel He-111, but still 50 miles per hour, slower than the Mosquito it was meant to intercept. The third prototype was an even harsher lesson. During a low-altitude dive test, it broke apart entirely. Investigators murmured about pilot error, but the truth was clear. The wood had delaminated mid-flight, tearing the wing from the fuselage. By 1944, the Mucha project had quietly died. All that remained were thick, meticulous reports tables, graphs, and, rare in German engineering documentation, despair. One senior engineer confessed that the design could never match British construction due to fundamental material limitations. Another scribbled in the margins of a test report, "We are fighting physics with paperwork." Inside the Reich Ministry of Aviation, no one wanted to deliver this news to Hermann Göring. His fury over the Mosquito was already legendary. He had promised Hitler the skies, yet wooden bombers continued to fly unchallenged over Berlin, mocking him with each daylight raid. When Göring finally learned of the Mucha's cancellation, he smashed a glass ashtray against the wall, shouting, "We are defeated by carpenters!" For the engineers, the humiliation cut deeper than any official reprimand. Germany had prided itself on precision metallurgy, on absolute control. And yet, the British had turned that world upside down. The Mosquito was not perfect. It was audacious. It broke every rule the Germans held sacred. Never trust organic materials. Never rely on manual craftsmanship. Never tolerate variability. And yet, it worked. Its wooden shell flexed where metal would crack, absorbed vibrations that would have torn rivets from steel. Henkel, who had observed the fiasco from close quarters, wrote in his personal journal that autumn, "We are trapped by our own logic. We have machines without imagination, and they have imagination without machines." He never sent the line to his superiors. It would have sounded like treason. But among peers, the sentiment spread quietly. The British had won not through industry, but through daring the impossible. As winter settled over the ruins of German cities, the Mosquitoes continued to haunt the skies. Polished wood gleamed under moonlight like specters. Below, engineers stood amidst warped wings, cracked fuselages, and the bitter tang of failed glue, powerless to replicate the miracle. The Mucha had delivered the lesson every engineer fears. Genius is easy to copy. Understanding it is impossible. By 1944, the Mosquito had transcended the label of aircraft. It had become a presence. It slipped through the night skies of Europe like a rumor, unpredictable, untouchable. Luftwaffe radar operators dreaded the fleeting blip that appeared, then vanished. Interceptor pilots called it Der Schattenjäger, the shadow hunter. Even ground troops, hearing the faint whine at dawn, knew to look up in fear. If a Mosquito could reach them, no one was safe. Statistics told the extraordinary truth. Heavy bombers like the Lancaster lost 5 to 7% of their crews per mission. The Mosquito? Less than 1% one aircraft, lost for every 200 sorties. Pilots who flew it could survive dozens of missions. They joked grimly that flying a Mosquito was safer than walking across Piccadilly after dark. Behind the humor, however, lay something extraordinary. An unarmed aircraft had become the most survivable machine in the Royal Air Force. Inside Germany, disbelief had become humiliation. Every intelligence report reaching Göring's desk reopened the wound. He had promised Hitler absolute air superiority, yet British bombers visited daily. The Mosquito, above all, seemed to choose its timing for maximum insult. In January 1943, it struck Berlin during a radio address by Göring. In January 1944, it repeated the feat during another high-profile meeting. Both times, it escaped untouched. Göring reportedly shouted, "I turn green with envy when I see those wooden aircraft flying over Berlin. The British can afford to lose pilots, but they don't. Because they fly so fast, our fighters cannot catch them." The reality was even harsher. The Luftwaffe had aged, while the Mosquito remained young. Germany's best pilots died faster than they could be replaced, and the new generation lacked the skill to combat an enemy that ignored every rule. Conventional bombers could be intercepted, predicted, herded into kill zones. The Mosquito defied every script. It appeared in singles and pairs, skimmed treetops, then vanished into clouds. By the time radar detected it, it was already gone. At Rechlin and Peenemünde, engineers scrambled to catch up faster interceptors, new variants of the Focke-Wulf 190, high-altitude Me-410s, even the jet-powered Me-262. On paper, these machines could outrun the Mosquito. In practice, they never arrived in the right place at the right time. Jet engines of the era demanded long, perfect runways, flawless fuel, and delicate handling. The Mosquito needed only a patch of grass and a pair of Merlin engines. To German civilians, it became something far more terrifying than a psychological weapon that penetrated the mind long before it touched the ground. Its raids were precise: railway stations, Gestapo offices, communication hubs. Yet the terror they inspired went far beyond the material damage. In Berlin, whispers spread that the British had built a plane invisible to radar. In occupied Copenhagen and Oslo, the resistance hailed each Mosquito appearance as proof that the Allies could strike anywhere, at any time. The roar of its engines became a sound of inevitability. The RAF understood its power and wielded it ruthlessly. When heavy bombers hammered German cities at night, Mosquitoes flew ahead, dropping incendiaries and flares to mark targets with surgical accuracy. As the bombers turned home, Mosquitoes returned hours later, striking rescue crews, command posts, supply depots. They seemed tireless, omnipresent, untouchable. Even a single Mosquito flying alone could force the Luftwaffe to scramble entire squadrons, burning fuel and exhausting pilots in futile pursuit. The German High Command responded with a mixture of desperation and strategy. New radar networks were installed to track fast targets. Propaganda officers insisted the Mosquito was overrated, claiming its speed came at the cost of payload. But numbers are stubborn. In 1944 alone, Mosquito bombers dropped over 19,000 tons of explosives, losing fewer than 200 aircraft. So efficient that one British officer quipped, "It's not a bomber, it's a surgical instrument." By autumn, Goering's frustration had hardened into superstition. He forbade aides from mentioning the aircraft by name during briefings, as if silence could erase it. Fighter command logs reveal a haunting pattern: exhausted pilots chasing phantoms that vanished into clouds, radar stations reporting echoes moving faster than calibration limits, ground crews swearing they glimpsed Mosquitoes at altitudes beyond any piston engine's reach. The myth had outgrown the machine. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, the engineer who had once dissected a captured Mosquito, watched it all unfold from his laboratory. He no longer corrected colleagues when they called the plane a ghost. In his private notes, he wrote, "It is not the wood that terrifies us. It is the idea that something so light can carry such power. By the final winter of the war, the very name Mosquito could silence a room in German command centers. Reports of sightings came with a sigh, not alarm. By the time the warning arrived, the damage was done. The Luftwaffe still flew, but its morale was hollow. To them, the Mosquito was not a mere aircraft. It was inevitability, precision, and humiliation molded into wings." When the war ended in 1945, the Mosquito had already become legend. It had flown more than 80,000 combat sorties, photography, bombing, pathfinding, night fighting, losing so few planes that even statisticians questioned their figures. In post-war European hangars, its sleek wooden fuselage seemed from another world, too elegant to have emerged from the chaos of conflict. Germany lay in ruins, its cities scorched by the very bombers the Mosquito had guided with uncanny precision. Yet for the engineers who survived, it wasn't the Lancaster or B-17 they remembered with awe. It was the wooden ghost that had humiliated their science. At war's end, Allied teams invited captured German engineers to tour de Havilland's plant at Hatfield. Among them was Henkel, the same man who had once dissected a downed mosquito and marveled at its glue. Now, in the assembly hall, he watched craftsmen in overalls polish the curved fuselage halves before bonding. The familiar sharp, chemical scent of resin filled the air again. He turned to his British escort, a young engineer barely out of university, and asked, "How many men designed this process?" The Britons smiled. "Not many," they said, "but thousands built it." That sentence lingered with Henkel for years. In his post-war report, he wrote that the mosquito's true secret was not chemistry or aerodynamics, but culture. The willingness to let craftsmen and scientists share the same space. Where German factories had been ruled by rigid hierarchy and fear of failure, the British encouraged improvisation. A violin maker could teach an engineer about resonance. A chemist could learn from a furniture worker. Out of that collision of worlds emerged something no pure theory could predict. The lessons spread quickly. In the late 1940s, engineers across the Atlantic began experimenting with laminated materials, fiberglass resin composites, and later carbon fiber, all direct descendants of the mosquito's wooden skin. What had been born from scarcity became the foundation of abundance. Even across the Atlantic, the nascent American aerospace industry took note. Engineers at Boeing studied de Havilland's methods with quiet reverence, eventually calling the Mosquito the ancestor of every composite airframe they would build decades later. In Britain, the aircraft's legend grew steadily, almost in whispers. The Royal Air Force kept Mosquitoes flying well into the 1950s, long after jets had claimed the skies. Pilots adored its agility, its near-silent passage through the air, and, above all, its soul. One veteran reflected, "It felt like the airplane wanted to live as much as you did." Museums displayed the Mosquito as a masterpiece of wartime design, gleaming under spotlights, admired for its sleek lines and audacious performance. Yet for those who had built it, its memory remained far more intimate. The scent of sawdust, the rhythmic brushing of glue, the sharp tap of piano craftsmen hammering spars together, while London burned under the Blitz. For de Havilland himself, the success was vindication. His impossible idea had not only worked, it had redefined engineering itself. He once told a journalist, "We were never trying to outmuscle the enemy. We were trying to outthink him." Those words would echo through every generation of designers who followed. For the Germans who had attempted to copy it, the Mosquito became a mirror reflecting their own limitations. The Mucha prototypes were eventually melted down, none surviving the war. Yet in the archives of what became West Germany's new aviation industry, Henkel's notes endured. The final line in his last wartime journal read simply, "They proved that imagination, when disciplined by necessity, is stronger than steel." Time transformed the Mosquito from a weapon into a lesson. It showed that progress often arises not from abundance, but from necessity. Not from raw metal and brute force, but from daring to find elegance in the ordinary. Out of plywood and glue rose a machine that terrified an empire, defied expectation, and redefined what was possible in the sky. Historians may still debate whether the Mosquito was the greatest aircraft of the Second World War, but the numbers speak for themselves. Faster than any fighter of its era, lighter than any bomber, and deadlier to the enemy's pride than to its troops. Walk past one in a museum today, and its polished wooden surface gleams like varnished oak. You can almost smell the resin, the ghost of that glue that once defied an empire. The men who built it are gone now, their names scattered across archives and airfields. Yet their idea remains alive every time a modern airliner lifts into the sky with composite wings, or a spacecraft launches wrapped in resin and fiber. They proved that technology is born not from comfort, but from courage. the courage to create what everyone else deems impossible. So the next time you see a photograph of a mosquito slender, smooth, silent, remember what it truly represented. Not merely British ingenuity, not merely wartime necessity, but the moment when imagination outran fear. When we dream beyond the bounds of logic, we honor that legacy.